Welcome everybody to this morning's Coffee and Conversation with our special guest, Stockton, Associate Dean and Professor at the Center for International Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Works closely on Taiwanese politics and Taiwanese issues. Now, some of you might be aware the United States is not the only country in the world that's having an election this year. In fact, some have already had elections this year. There was a big one in Taiwan in January, which some analysts have said might have profound effects, not only on Taiwanese politics, but on Taiwan, China, and U.S. relations. To walk us through those issues today and open up a conversation, please join me in welcoming Stockton.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and my thanks to Hiroki for extending the invitation and to be here at the Tower Center. Yes, Taiwan's January 2016 elections. So I always want to try to appeal to my audience, so I'll back off some of the more academic-y issues and try to get it more into some of the policy implications of the election just recently. And so, of course, here you have the three happy candidates, only one of which won the election. Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, Mr. Eric Chu of the Kuomintang, or Chinese Nationalist Party, and, of course, Mr. James Song, the perennial bridesmaid, never the bride. But anyway, it was a fascinating election. There was really never a suspenseful moment, though, from the very early stages when the KMT was unable to find a good candidate to run for run as its candidate, and I'll get into that in just a second. I was in Taiwan the 2 weeks leading up to the election as an election observer. And the first time I saw an election campaign in Taiwan was back in 1992, when it held its complete renewal elections of the legislature. And we can talk about how campaigns and elections have changed over the course of time, if you'd like to, during the Q&A. So I think, given the conversations I've had with some of you already, most of you are aware of why we should really give much concern about Taiwan, why it matters. If you want to read the book, Shelley Rigger wrote a book recently called Why Taiwan Matters that captures that. But essentially, we have a long-lasting relationship with the Republic of China dating back to the mainland days in World War II. Despite derecognition of the Republic of China in 1978, the United States has maintained a very close relationship in terms of economics, cultural exchange, and strategic cooperation under the Taiwan Relations Act and the three communiques. Taiwan represents one link in the Western Pacific chain of industrialized, democratic, and American-friendly nations, which is important to the United States, increasingly so with tensions emerging in the South China and East China Seas. Taiwan is the ninth, as of 2015, was our ninth largest trading partner. Most of that, of course, being our exports, our imports, not so much our exports. Taiwan in 2015-14 was the second largest arms purchaser for the United States, a very important client. Also, Taiwan represents a bellwether for American commitment to the ideals of democracy and capitalism in the region. And of course, Taiwan, if things go south with China, Taiwan's prominence in our strategic planning would be very important. So, January 2016 elections. The incumbent party, the Kuomintang, or Chinese Nationalist Party, candidate was Zhu Lilun, the party chairman, and Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, and the third major candidate was James Song of the People First Party. You see that Tsai wins the election with a pretty commanding majority, especially in a three-candidate race with 56%. She won majorities in 18 of 22 constituencies, so there was no question. The Democratic Progressive Party did not squeak by in winning the presidency, as happened in 2004. And in 2000, when it first captured the presidency, it won a bare plurality. So we have a real mandate, a popular mandate for this president. Legislative elections were also held at the same time, and you see the Democratic Progressive Party winning about 60% of the seats in the legislature. So not only do you now have a Democratic Progressive Party president, you have for the first time a Democratic Progressive Party majority in the legislature. This was something that former President Chen Shui-bian from 2000 to 2008 never had a chance to enjoy. So we have a real chance to see some change in Taiwan. So some of the significant aspects of the election. This 2016 marked the worst, the most abysmal electoral outcome the KMT has experienced since its beginnings. Produced the first non-KMT legislative majority. The first time the Democratic Progressive Party captured more than 51% of the national vote in presidential and legislative elections. The first time the DPP will control both the executive and the legislative branches. The first time the Democratic Progressive Party was able to erode the iron vote northern area of Taiwan in the Taipei and New Taipei city areas. So it's broken that KMT stronghold. And notable also were the, I hate to say the words, the fringe parties or the more extreme parties on either side of the KMT and DPP. The Taiwan Solidarity Union was much more aggressively pro-independence than the DPP has been in the recent years. They failed to win any seats. And then the new party, which is a KMT more right-wing or pro-reunification party, also failed to lose seats. So one of the outcomes of the election is a moderation, ideologically speaking, of the DPP and the KMT to some extent. Let's see, which way am I going? Is that one? Yeah. Now, what helps us understand the drubbing that the KMT experienced? And I have to be careful because some interpretations of reality and perception can be a bit partisan. So, for example, when the economy became a major issue in the election, the Democratic Progressive Party painted the Ma policies as abysmal failures. Taiwan's gross domestic product was not growing at the rate that people would like to see. But at the same time, since 2007, Taiwan has experienced the global recession along the same paths as other countries, and that the growth rate in Taiwan could be argued to have been better than it could have been without the Ma economic policies and rapprochement with Beijing. But one of the big issues that did emerge was rising underemployment among younger workers, especially college graduates. There is this intense fear of their economic future of young people, or by young people in Taiwan, and they gravitated en masse to the Democratic Progressive Party. Also, you have a lot of problems with affordable housing, especially for young professionals. Real estate prices in the urban areas are immense barriers to starting lives and futures for a lot of young Taiwan workers. Also, there were a lot of sustainability issues that have come up as major areas of interest and concern in Taiwan. They have to do with quality of life, they have to do with the environment, gender relationships, old age care, and the KMT was simply unable to tend to so many rising interests in ways that voters were satisfied with. Obviously, the pace and scope of Taipei-Beijing rapprochement was a concern, as indicated by many surveys. People weren't so much opposed to the increasing economic integration as they were at the perceived pace and depth of the integration under Ma's policies. Now, I'm sure you'll all remember, in 2008, Ma Ying-jeou wins the first election. He's reelected in 2012. He ran on a campaign of improved relations with Beijing, in particular economic relations. He ran on a campaign of no independence, no reunification, and no war. That made Beijing happy and made the United States happy. Things were going to calm down, and the U.S. could move its focus into other areas that we deemed to be more pressing. This culminated in 2010 with the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, ECFA, in which I think ultimately more than 20 different agreements were signed between Taipei and Beijing that opened each other's markets to import and export. And this, of course, led to about 28 or 29% of Taiwan's economy now being dependent on mainland trade. That began to concern voters. And so we have that happening. And of course, that all culminates in November 7, 2015, with Ma Ying-jeou's meeting with Xi Jinping in Singapore. A defining historical moment. I'm sure Ma had Nobel Peace Prizes floating in his head. The problem was that this was not met with equally resounding support in Taiwan. The meeting took place without much heads up or advance notice. I have friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that were just as surprised as I was. And the meetings were deemed to be not very transparent. There was not much popular input. Ma was very circumspect in the early days after the meeting, or leading in, or I should say in the day or two after the meeting, about what was said exactly at the meeting and whether or not he honored Taiwan's national dignity. All of these economic and cross-strait issues result in the rise of new social movements in Taiwan, where it really took on the feel of a populist environment, where you have the sunflower movement and occupation of the Legislative Yuan from March 18 to April 10. You have any number of social movements taking to the streets in Taiwan, demanding the KMT be kind of directly responsible and accountable to them. And the Democratic Progressive Party ate it up. There were, of course, lots of conspiracies about whether or not they were coordinating, whether they'd trained some of the sunflower movement leaders, these kinds of things. The sunflower occupation of the legislature, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was the result of protests against the Cross-Strait Trade and Services legislation that had been jammed through. Oh, let me qualify that a little better. It had been jammed up in the legislature as the party caucuses sought to reach an agreeable solution, but then it was jammed through on a particular day in about 10 minutes without much of, on a procedural basis rather than there being kind of an open vote about it. Again, concerns about transparency, accountability, China's encroachment or increasing presence in Taiwan's economy. The Cross-Strait Trade and Services Agreement was especially important because about 70% of Taiwan's gross domestic product comes from the services industry. And so when you liberalize that in the face of cheaper competition in the mainland, those same young professionals who are already fearful of their economic futures really latched onto this as a threat to that. Now, the 2014 local elections in Taiwan were a bit of a harbinger as well. After 2014, many people said the writing was on the wall for the Chinese Nationalist Party coming into the 2016 national elections. You'll see, for example, the KMT going into the 2014 local election held executive control of 15 constituencies. They were reduced to control of 6 after the local election. The Democratic Progressive Party in control of only 6 executives in the local level, up to 13. And then independents captured 3 constituencies, the most remarkable of which was Taipei City. For that to be captured by a green DPP-leaning mayoral candidate was a real loss to the KMT. So it wasn't looking good coming into 2016 for the KMT. Now, on top of the issue areas, the KMT, I mean, it's amazing. Those of us that have watched Taiwan politics for so long, the KMT has been such a powerful party. They're one of the wealthiest parties in the world. Had maintained legislative dominance of Taiwan since its seclusion to Taiwan in 1949. And to see it just disintegrate was I guess the Republican debates right now are seen as reality TV. Well, watching the KMT disintegrate and implode was much like that. And so we see, for example, back in 2013, Ma Ying-jeou went after the second most powerful man in the KMT, Mr. Wang Jinping, who is leader of what's called the local KMT faction. He's a southern boy, seemed to be somewhat conciliatory towards the Democratic Progressive Party and its leanings, and Ma went after him for influence peddling back in 2013, and failed in that effort to have Wang Jinping not only kicked out of the party, but have his position as president of the legislature terminated as a result. So that was a real overreach on his part. KMT heavy hitters refused to step into the party nomination process leading into 2016's elections. And so the person who ends up being nominated is the vice president of the Legislative Yuan, Hong Xiuqiu, who, if I may, was a bit of a Sarah Palin of Taiwan politics. She went off script. She was seen to be in conflict with party elders, in particular Ma Ying-jeou, who was chairman of the party. In Taiwan, there are colors mean a great deal. Blue for the Nationalist Party, pro-reunification, China kind of legacy. For the Democratic Progressive Party, green, great for the island of Taiwan, more local, more Taiwan kind of separation from the Chinese state. And then, of course, red, the Communist Party. And to describe Hong Xiuqiu, the color I would use would be purple. She was so blue and so friendly towards the communist reunification with communist China. I think if you combine blue and red, you get purple. And this was a non-starter with no more than about 8% of Taiwan's population. And it was such a terrible situation. The polls had Tsai Ing-wen winning with 60% of the vote from the second Hong Xiuqiu was nominated. The party did the only thing it could do, and it revoked through a special Congress her candidacy. And on October 17th, 2015, replaced her with Eric Chu. Well, whether or not you like the KMT very much, you have to feel sorry for a guy who has less than 3 months to put together a national campaign. And so this was not a good thing. In contrast to the relative unity of the Democratic Progressive Party, the nomination process was very smooth. It was so abbreviated, there was no time for the KMT to kind of listen in the wings and wait for other DPP contenders to drag out muck against Tsai Ing-wen. She was also able to moderate the DPP image. The DPP struggle after 2008 was really between the old guard, kind of the revolutionaries in the party, and an emerging, more centrist or moderate group who still retained an affinity for Taiwan. They're Taiwanese. They have no desire for reunification, but they were able, for very pragmatic reasons, to put that farther off center stage. And Tsai was able to kind of coordinate and centralize those moderates in the party and keep everybody on message and keep everybody on task, so that there were no kind of odd pronouncements from radicals in the party that would scare DC or that would concern Beijing any more than they're already concerned, that would antagonize or alienate Taiwan voters into being fearful of what the DPP was really intending to do. And so they controlled the framing, issue framing and message the entire campaign. To kind of capture this as a useful graphic, this is the island of Taiwan, and you see it divided into its various electoral constituencies. The blue represents, in '96, the KMT majorities in that presidential election across the island. There was only one area in the center of Taiwan that went for the new party candidate at the time. The rest of the island was very KMT, majority voting. And it goes through each of the presidential elections to 2016. And so what you see happening is in the South, 2000, 2004, 08, 2012, this is the Democratic Progressive Party stronghold. Tainan is the home to Taiwan culture. It's the traditional kind of non-Taipei capital, so to speak. And it's an area around which the Democratic Progressive Party has kind of grown up and receives most of its support. And so you have that north-south, blue north, green south divide. Well, this is what happens in 2016, again, as a demonstration of the drubbing experienced by the KMT. They lost even their stronghold areas in the north. So is there any question that Tsai Ing-wen has been elected president? No. Is there any question that her party enjoys a commanding majority in the legislature? No. Does she have a real mandate? Absolutely. But the question is going to be, what exactly is that mandate? And we can talk about that in just a bit. I'm going to skip over those and just talk about this very quickly. One of my areas of specialization is in electoral system reform, and I'm not going to bore many of you with that right now. Just to say that in 2005, Taiwan adopted a system of majoritarian voting for the legislature. It went from a semi-proportional, kind of multi-party, very diverse legislature to one that is now commandingly a two-party system, one that produces majority party, single party majority government. All right, and so we see that happening by design. It seems that going back to 2005, both of the major parties, the KMT and the DPP, wanted to create a system that favored governance at the expense of representation, and those majorities have emerged. The parties, the KMT prior to 2016, held a commanding majority in the legislature. And the Taiwan people seem to be willing, through their ballots, to grant these parties a mandate to rule, to go do what you told us to do. Well, this is another problem that emerges in that apparently the KMT misunderstood exactly what their mandate was going to be, because based on rapprochement with Beijing, increasing economic integration, no reunification, no independence, no war, Ma came in and thought that this is what he was to do. And we see that bites him in the end. And we'll talk about that in a second. And so I say here the KMT got too far out front of the Taiwan voter. Determining or interpreting those election results is obviously an important task for governing parties. So very quickly, summary results of the election. Big one is that policy now matters in Taiwan. Up until, all the way to 2012, the main divide in Taiwan was the so-called ethnic divide or generational divide. People that were on Taiwan prior to the arrival of the Kuomintang in 1945, those that came after, those that came with the Kuomintang and the party apparatus and the military after the Civil War, were really the foundation, grassroots support, and their offspring for the KMT. And that was always what drove elections. I mean, people didn't talk about trash pickup and dog catchers and potholes in streets. They talked about, are you Taiwanese or are you Chinese? And that was it became very chauvinistic. My best friends are very green. My wife's family are Weisenren. They came with the Kuomintang in 1949. And so I've seen that chauvinism on both sides. Major issue still remains, though, the relationship between Taipei and Beijing. And again, that rapprochement was seen to be going a little too far, too fast. And we'll more on that in just a second. And of course, KMT being fractured along factional lines made them ripe for defeat from the very get-go. So, how did the KMT train go so far off the tracks? Now, for a general policy audience, why is this important? The United States has been just beyond itself with joy over the last 8 years, because while Ma Ying-jeou developed closer relations with Beijing, Taiwan as a major flashpoint for U.S. national security concerns really took a back burner, took a back seat. You didn't have, we're going to join the UN. You didn't have, we want to be Taiwan, we're not China. And in fact, you had this incredible love fest between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party. And so again, like we said earlier, the U.S. could concern itself with other ongoing inflammatory or exploding issues. And so the DPP, on the other hand, has been traditionally identified as the party of independence. Now, what does that mean? It meant in the early days that Taiwan would break away from the Chinese state, that it would not be the Republic of China, it would be Republic of Taiwan, that the Constitution of the Republic of China would be abrogated, the name of the country would be changed, and there'd be new constitutional assembly that made it very clear that there's governments, separate and non-reunifiable governments on either side. One of the things that Tsai Ing-wen was able to do during this campaign, though, was she visits Washington, D.C. She meets with all the right folks here, as was traditional in Taiwan elections. Eric Chu did the same thing, Hong Shou-Chu, before she was given the boot. And these parties make their assurances. And unlike in 2012, Tsai Ing-wen, which was the candidate then, was able to convince the American establishment that she had moderated her message, that there would not be any declarations of independence, that she would tone down the rhetoric, sufficiently so that we stayed out of the election. Unlike in 2012, when Tsai had a much more combative tone, kept the United States at further distance, and the U.S., maybe not serving officials, but past officials, made very public pronouncements about uncertainty and instability should the DPP win back in 2012. And I couldn't tell you, Tsai Ing-wen couldn't have been any less happy with the United States. And that didn't help the relationship much. But since then, obviously she's been able to convince the establishment here that she is not going to go out of her way to cause problems, or even saying that is difficult. So the KMT assumed that economic voters would gravitate towards the Cross-Strait rapprochement and reward them electorally. This is why they thought they were elected. This is what they thought would serve them in the 2016 election. They failed to realize that the same economic voters were becoming very concerned about relations being too close with Beijing, and as a result, the national dignity of Republic of China on Taiwan was taking a hit, and they were unhappy with that. The KMT failed miserably attracting young voters. The KMT misinterpreted rising KMT support with Taiwanese identifiers. They assumed that declining ethnic divide on the island, no longer being identified as the Chinese party or the Taiwan party, we're all Taiwanese, let's campaign as a unified nation. So they thought that declining ethnic divide would serve them well in the electoral process. Chairman Ma failed to master the KMT factions. He made the biggest mistake in the world, and that was to take on Wang Jinping, who is largely bulletproof in his faction as factional leader. And under the chairmanship of Tsai Ing-wen, again, as I said earlier, the DPP was able to present a more moderate, unified message to curtail the radicals or the old revolutionaries in the party, at least in terms of public pronouncements. This is a graph that I'm sure many of you have seen before. It's taken by the Election Studies Center at National Chung Cheng University. If you do survey research, Taiwan is a gold mine. It's reliable data, and there's tons of it. And so since '92, the Election Studies Center has taken surveys that ask people whether or not they feel themselves to be Taiwanese, Chinese, or both, Chinese and Taiwanese. And so you see back in '92, the purple line, most people as far back as that, we said, well, yeah, I mean, my ancestors come from China, the mainland, but I live here in Taiwan, and this is my home now. So civilizationally, we're Chinese, but Taiwan is my home. The blue indicates I'm Chinese, 我是中国人. And you see what's happened to that by 2015 is a very, very small percentage of the population. The green line is interesting, and this is I'm Taiwanese, 我是台湾人. And you see from 17% back in '92 to nearly 60% by the end of 2015. Right. Well, this is the thing that really confused not only the Kuomintang or the KMT, but also Beijing. So Beijing is like, wow, okay, in 2012 and 2008 and 2012, the KMT wins large majorities in the presidential election as well as the legislative elections. At the same time that Taiwanese identification is rising. So despite the fact that Taiwanese identification is rising, the voters are electing the KMT to these very large majorities. So despite the fact that people on Taiwan are quote-unquote Taiwanese and not Taiwanese, they're still supporting KMT's pro-China, pro-Beijing policies. So we can push this. We can continue to push. And talk about misreading the tea leaves. All right? This was a major mistake that the KMT as well as Beijing made. It created this false expectation that the people on Taiwan were going to be okay with greater rapprochement. Here's another graph that's pretty busy. I'll interpret. And this is the question that asks people what their preference for Taiwan's future would be. And it ranges from reunification now to some sort of continuation of the status quo to independence now. And what you see in the black and the blue lines are maintain the status quo. Don't reunify with Beijing right now, but don't break away permanently from some sort of relationship with the two. And so by 2015, you've got, 60% of the population. Some form of don't rock the boat. Keep things the way they are now. Independence would be this group here, 16% plus maintain status quo, move toward independence at some point. That's the green line. And then independence now, ASAP, is the black. So you've got 4.7 and 16, so about 21% of the population wants to see Taiwan kind of break away from this we're China, and that includes the mainland kind of claim. So once again, Beijing and the KMT say, well, our policies that promote the status quo for now, no independence, no reunification, jive with what 60% of the population says they want to happen. So we're going to engage with Beijing on economic and trade terms, and we'll save the tough questions, the political questions, for later. And this really helped the Kuomintang in the first 4 years. The problem is when Ma and Xi meet, what do you think? What do you think? Xi is there to talk about trade and services and Taiwanese mangoes, right? The symbolism of it was, you know what? We've talked about the easy issues. We've tackled the easy issues. As heads of our relevant political parties, let's talk about something more. And this was how a lot of people in Taiwan responded negatively to that meeting. Well, what else are they talking about? And there's the whole thing about issuing transcripts, and were there asides, and were there confidential comments, and all this business.
Can I ask a quick question on that last...
they warned me this
week. Well, it's okay.
Backwards.
It's okay. There were 10% that were non-responsive.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of who those folks are? Because I'm looking at that line, at that sort of pinkish purple line, and it gets up to 26 right around the 95 crisis, right? So my hunch would be these are people who say we just got to keep our heads down and not say anything provocative. Do you think that's that same logic now, that 10% might actually be more towards status quo, they just don't want to talk about it?
Well, in the early days... Or
do they really not have
Well, so, for example, in the early days, this was largely, who is this on the phone, and why are you asking me this question? Right? Democracy in Taiwan in the early 90s was, there are a lot of people that weren't going to respond to a question like this. I can tell you that while we get into the last 5 years, the folks that I talk to honestly don't know. Right, so it's not like it's not non-responsive. I'm not going to answer the question. It's
legitimately.
I really don't know, and these are smart, thoughtful people who Taiwan people are often seen to be very pragmatic. And I'd love to wave the nationalist flag and be Taiwanese, or the Taiwan nation flag and be Taiwanese, but we know what that would result in, and that's Beijing's military or otherwise intervention. So this is the misreading the tea leaves I just mentioned. The rise in Taiwanese identification did not result in KMT losses in 2008 and 2012. Declining support for reunification did not produce KMT losses in those years. The KMT won instead solid majorities. They won landslide victories. So the KMT and the CCP assumed that this electoral support jived with tighter relations, and it certainly didn't. Now, to illustrate this, let me go back up. I got to do that again. To illustrate this, the Taiwan election, TEDS, Taiwan Elections and Democratization Study, TEDS, TEDS, is a survey taken by the Election Studies Center at National Chengchi University. And they asked people the same questions we've seen. Do you identify with which political party? Who did you vote for in the presidential election? Do you identify as Taiwanese, Chinese, or both? There's another question that's a bit different than the future status graph I just showed you. And that is, okay, look, assume that we were able to declare independence and China would not attack. What is your future preference then? Because that really captures an aspirational response rather than a pragmatic, well, if we do anything, the Chinese will attack, so I'm against independence. And so what I've done is taken that survey data from 2004, 2008, and 2012. I'm working on the 2014 local election surveys to illustrate one point. And that is, this is people that identified as DPP, Democratic Progressive Party supporters in 2004. Those above the middle line here agree to independence at a future date if we're not attacked. Those below that line were opposed to some sort of future independence regardless. Folks on this side of the black line identify themselves as Taiwanese. Those here are both Taiwanese Chinese. And then this is the smallest group. Of course, I'm Chinese without kind of that Taiwan local identity. And what you see in the 2004 presidential election, the vast majority of Democratic Progressive Party support was, I'm Taiwanese and I support some future independence. The DPP was having a lot of difficulty kind of expanding its electoral appeal to folks that thought in different combinations or variations. They were able to capture some of the vote as well. But very few of the I'm opposed to independence would be voting for the Democratic Progressive Party. This is what happens in 2008. And this is, of course, those survey respondents. And so, again, large chunk of DPP supporters vote for the presidential candidate because they're Taiwanese and they favor Taiwan's future independent status. And then 2012, we see that again. So basically by 2012, the Democratic Progressive Party support base was more or less ghettoized into a very particular constituency. You cannot win national elections if you're not appealing to at least a larger portion of that core grassroots support base. So hold that thought. Now here's the KMT in 2004. This is the middle line for Taiwanese. So very, very few as a percentage of I'm Taiwanese people voting for KMT or identifying with the KMT party. Largely the both category and then the Chinese category. And there's really no differentiation between I'm pro or anti-independence at some time. This is that ethnic divide that was so central to Taiwan politics. What happens though in 2008 when the KMT recaptured the presidency and drubbed the DPP, the KMT appeal starts to expand beyond that traditional support base. And so people that say, well, I'm Taiwanese, are now voting more for the KMT, the China party, than they are the DPP, which is the we're Taiwanese party. And then 2012, we see a further expansion of that. So the KMT was really kind of taking on the function or the role of an umbrella party in Taiwan. Again, leading to Beijing and the KMT misreading the tea leaves in terms of support for improving relations. And I think Washington, D.C. also falls into this a little bit. And we were surprised by the extent of opposition to the KMT in 2012. So moving forward, May 20th, 2016, Tsai Ing-wen takes office. She will continue to serve as the Democratic Progressive Party party chair. So in effect, you have the fusion of executive and legislative control. Tsai campaigned on a policy to uphold the status quo, but she refused to acknowledge the so-called 1992 consensus. And the 1992 consensus was an agreement between the KMT and the Communist Party back in 92 that there is one China, but two interpretations, or different interpretations. And the Chinese side would explain to their folks that it meant, well, right now there's these guys in Taipei, they support one China, eventual reunification, but they've got their own ideas maybe about how that'll work. They're wrong, but we'll be patient with them. And on the Taiwan side, the 1992 consensus meant that there is a sovereign government in Taipei called the Republic of China, but eventually there will be one China, and ideally we'd be the ones somehow involved in governing a democratic China. Right? So everyone kind of went home and told their own constituencies what they wanted to hear. Well, Tsai campaigned on the status quo, which has actually made my KMT friends want to tear their hair out. He says, what has Tsai Ing-wen been criticizing for the last 8 years? The status quo is untenable and it's unsustainable, and now she's using the exact same language. And Tsai Ing-wen said basically, look, there's no need to declare independence for Taiwan. We're already a sovereign country called the Republic of China. Taiwan is the Republic of China. The Republic of China is Taiwan. So Americans, no, we're not going to be declaring independence anytime soon. We're okay with the fact that we already are. Now, what it means, though, is that she has no interest whatsoever in reunifying with China, or mainland China. I know I got to wrap this up. Obviously, then, of course, the diminishing ethnic divide, emerging Taiwan nation, moves Taiwan away from political reunification in the future. And this conversation is what the U.S. is most concerned about. As I said earlier, when Tsai visited the United States and in communications since then, she's assured the United States that we're not going to revive the kind of the national chauvinism that we saw from 2000 to 2008 under Chen Shui-bian. She's not really talked much at all about Taiwan trying to join the United Nations to create kind of 2 China seats. She's indicated a willingness to continue arms purchases from the United States. And she's also said that she'll reinvestigate the pork import problem. Taiwan has not allowed for U.S. pork imports because of ractopamine, various additives that we feed our pigs that ends up in the pork, and that violates Taiwan's kind of health standard for parts per million of whatever this element is. Oddly enough, I think the future of U.S.-Taiwan relationship hinges on Taiwan purchasing more pork. So anyway. So no general path forward for the PRC. They're going to have to put pressure on the Tsai administration. They cannot allow the world to think that they're okay with anything but forward movement towards political reunification with Beijing. And so we're likely to see resumption of diplomatic competition, the end of the so-called diplomatic truce. Taiwan, Republic of China, is now down to 21 or 22 diplomatic allies, and rest assured that China will go after the remainder. China will probably likely increase its isolation of Taiwan in non-governmental organizations. Miss Earth Day competition this year. Taiwan's candidate to the Miss Earth Day competition wore on her sash the Republic of China flag, and the Chinese had her banned from the competition. Right? So it could be the International Suit Makers Organization, it could be Miss Earth Day, it could be anything in which Taiwan, as Republic of China, tries to have itself represented. Economic sanctions. There's already scuttlebutt coming out of Taiwan that about 20% of Chinese tourism has disappeared since the election. I could tell you the 2 weeks leading into the election, I rarely heard a mainland accented Chinese in Taipei. In the Howard Plaza Hotel, you could go to Gugong, the National Palace Museum, and actually get in and see exhibits, which has become increasingly less common. And so they're likely to pull back on tourism, likely to reduce imports from Taiwan, and likely to start to sanction, if Tsai triggers some sort of response, Taiwanese businessmen in the mainland. There's over 1 million Taiwanese working living in the mainland on an annual basis. And we're likely to see the increasing militarization of cross-strait relations. Now, the Chinese haven't backed down from this. Last 2015, pictures came out of China with PLA military drills practicing the invasion of the presidential palace. And so, there is a mock-up of the presidential palace, and PLL forces are practicing their decapitation strikes. And the rhetoric about outside interference in China's domestic affairs is also likely to increase as Taiwan is kind of moved up the priority list of conversation between Beijing and the U.S. March 6th, just a couple of days ago, Xi Jinping reminds everybody that secessionism or separation or violations of the nation's sovereignty will not be accepted. For, of course, these references to all Chinese compatriots on either side of the strait. Well, what's it mean when 70% of your population in Taiwan no longer sees themselves as Chinese compatriots? Then finally, the U.S. is going to be back in the mix. We've had an 8-year grace period, and now it's going to be back in the front. We've been allowed to take a passive role. That will change as whether it's active or passive actions force us to say things on behalf of our commitments to Taiwan. Taipei-Beijing relations are likely to sour. There will be a revival of the game of diplomatic chicken between the U.S. and Beijing or China over arms sales. That will be the first thing that Xi Jinping complains about, as used to be the case. And the Taiwan Congressional Caucus will likely become much more vocal. So during the last 8 years, Ma wanted to improve relations with Beijing. And outside influences kind of aggravating that relationship were told to simmer down. I don't think he used the term simmer down, but that's basically what people were asked to do. So the Taiwan Caucus in the U.S. Congress was really very quiet. Right? The U.S. State Department didn't want any kind of turbulence, and so everyone's kind of keep quiet, let them continue to have this rapprochement, and everybody benefits. Well, now with the DPP administration, Taiwan's national dignity, whether as Republic of China or Taiwan or Republic of China on Taiwan or whatever they call it, is going to be moved up. And so they will put the screws on elected officials in the U.S. to make more kind of public, more vociferous announcements that are pro-Taiwan and anti, kind of, in that Cold War vein, anti-China and communism and all that good business. So on the horizon, Taiwan's membership in the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, will be very much on the American agenda. How we manage that while excluding Beijing is always a question. Regional security arrangements, the Japan, U.S., and Taiwan relationship in terms of security arrangements, I think, will become more advanced or at least better developed. U.S., China, will Taiwan become part of our pivot, or a more kind of obvious part of our pivot? Secretary of State Clinton went out of her way in any kind of public pronouncements about the Asia pivot. She went out of her way to keep Taiwan from kind of appearing in that conversation for fear of antagonizing the mainland. And I think we're going to see that kind of move to the fore. And then, of course, the next presidential election. Democrats have traditionally been pretty weak on Taiwan. Republicans have been kind of more pro-Taiwan because they're more suspicious of China. But goodness knows what's going to come out of our election process. None of the candidates have developed much in the way of positions on Taiwan, so we don't know. I'll shut my yap. Hopefully I've told you something you didn't already know. I appreciate your attention.
Very good. Wonderful. We do have time for questions. I've got one that I have to ask. You noted the analogy between the sort of disintegration of the KMT and the American Republican Party. I'm wondering if Tsai Ing-wen runs the risk of becoming an Obama character. Right? So Obama comes in and he energizes the Democratic base, but it turns out he's a pretty moderate guy. Mm-hmm. And if you talk to liberal activists, they're often very frustrated with him. And so you see this pushback. You see popularity for Bernie Sanders, for instance, right? Does the DPP have the same risk? That is, if they play the moderation game too much, do they risk internal fracturing?
Well, so coming out of the Sunflower Movement, right? You've got college kids occupying the legislature for weeks. You've got other organizations, whether they're environmental or workers' rights or anything else, kind of coming up and really, like I mentioned the word populism earlier, and it wasn't that too far removed from this idea that the groups in society could have this direct input and directly influence decisions being made by government. And the DPP didn't go out of its way to discourage that. And in fact, we want transparency and accountability. Well, now try to run a country with that kind of transparency and accountability, and you're dealing with obvious issues that maybe not so much are good for that. So I think Tsai has about, she's got a honeymoon period. But if they don't start to deliver, the very same groups that brought down the KMT are going to feed on the DPP. Yes, sir.
I may be completely off base, but would you think that what's happening in Hong Kong, between China and Hong Kong, has had a significant effect on how the Taiwanese are looking at their relationship with China?
It only took about 10 years after '97 for people on Taiwan to just absolutely reject one country, two systems solution. What was it, 2 years ago with the umbrella? Was it a year and a half or so? The umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. People on Taiwan were watching that. And in fact, people argue the umbrella revolution was in part sparked by the sunflower movement in Taiwan. And so, any one country, two systems is absolutely unacceptable to vast majorities of Taiwan people. And I think if China would have played its cards a little differently, and it still can, to liberalize Hong Kong politics, to allow the Hong Kong people a little more control over who their candidates are, let alone, they can vote for whoever they want, but the candidates are all pre-selected. So they're not willing, they're not willing to give up the hard-fought democracy that they have today. And as Americans, it's really easy to be jaded about kind of commitment to democracy, but people in Taiwan are very, very much, your average citizen is still very much committed to democracy. And one country, two systems would not survive that.
Yeah, I'd like to put my question on also on Josh's question. That is, moderate versus radical in the DPP supporters, and especially the group called Natural Independent, like Kianran group.
The New Power Party?
New Power Party, and then there's a group like the slogan called Kianran group.
Okay.
It's called Natural Independent, and they were the kind of radical force of the DPP supporters, and so moderate and radicals were united against ECFA, right? For anti-China position, but now Tsai is clearly expressing the interest in the membership of the TPP, and then a lot of the radicals in the DPP share the common interests with the protectionist groups in Taiwan, like farmers in the south, etc. Right. So, do you think Taipei or the Tsai's interest in a more pro-US, more pro-TPP, more pro-free trade, does it keep uniting the Taiwan's DPP sides more, or it might it cause the source of the split in the DPP?
One of the saving graces for the DPP has been its ability to reach further into urban populations and urban constituencies. Rural support, for example, in Taiwan, farmers have traditionally been KMT supporters because of KMT subsidies. They took care of the patronage network. And the percentage of employment in Taiwan related to agriculture and fishing is quite small. And so you could play the math and say, so free trade agreements kind of jeopardize those industries, but as long as we can protect our service base, then we could survive any kind of splits potentially. But factory workers, the few that are left in Taiwan, fear trade agreements the same way American factory workers do. The ECFA presented a real boon to the Taiwanese economy until the Chinese started to say, okay, now we want access to your economy. The Chinese first they gave, And then it was time for them to take, and that's when people started to really back off of ECFA. But you know, the labor, the traditional left-right spectrum in Taiwan, or in European and American, North American politics, has yet to really take hold in Taiwan. The KMT supported progressive causes, the same as the DPP has done. The KMT was the party for farmers, was the party for labor under, you know, kind of corporatization of interest groups. So I think we're only now seeing policy become ascendant and those ideological, traditional left-right cleavages start to take shape. And yeah, I'd agree, Tsai has to be careful, or she will antagonize a small but important part of her party.
So identity plays a huge role in the story that you're telling. But to look from the other side of the strait for China, the Chinese are starting to also play up identity, Han Chinese identity in a big way, and that plays out in, like, we don't, you know, way more than 70% of Tibetans don't view themselves as Chinese. That doesn't stop them from thinking that that's part of China either.
Yeah.
And but then with the prescriptions, as part of the reason that is the case is because there is this decline in economic. Their economic system is hitting this rough patch, but the prescriptions that you say that they might follow seem to be cutting their nose off to spite their face. So if they start to fear this Taiwanese identity, this rising Taiwanese tide, the idea of kicking out the million Taiwanese businessmen, that would just gut their economic system at this critical point. So are they cognizant of this? Is there this chicken game that they're playing with each other? Because if they it seems like this could go very wrong very quickly if they allowed that to happen.
Well, the Communist Party has learned a lot. I mean, we've been able to see its learning curve. 96 missile tests leading up to the presidential election. And since then, they've really tried to be as less obviously interventionist in trying to sway election outcomes. But the cutting off one's nose to spite one's face, Taiwan represents a fairly small chunk of China's overall economy. It's a major source of investment in technology with moving the factories, semiconductor factories, or all the iPhone factories, or whatever the case is, to China. The Chinese can hurt longer and deeper than the Taiwanese can. And so if China were to disrupt those jobs, that investment, the revenues, Taiwan couldn't hold out very long at all. China uses what's called a united front tactic, going back to the good old days, quote unquote, in which they court Taiwanese business people. They remind them how much easier their life is and how smooth paperwork gets processed these days. Wouldn't it be a shame if it was disrupted? And so you'll see in the beginnings just kind of very subtle threats, and the Chinese are sophisticated enough to see, all right, which level of threat works and what's the response. And they're not going to jump right into some major sanction. And so it's largely reciprocal, the responses from Beijing now. I don't see it as them getting too far out front. But yeah, eventually it would hurt both sides. But China can take a bigger hit than Taiwan can any day. I don't see that being the first option. So.
Well, we've got a little over time. There's obviously a lot more to say, but I would like to please join me in thanking our speaker, David Stockton, Professor.
Thank you very much. Now pulled me back and put me in my box.
No, not at all. That was great. We have a thing this afternoon.
Yeah, I know.
We'll see it.